a medieval Muslim sociologist. One could call him the first historiographer or sociologist that turned historiography and sociology into a science as we know it today, into something that resembles mathematical models of history. So you could see Ibn Khaldun as the father, as the founder of this kind of discipline, as the archetypal psychohistorian, so to say. And what Ibn Khaldun coined, especially, is a term that is used even today within, for example, Turkmen's theories, and that is the notion of asabiyyah. So, asabiyyah is to be understood as the sense of oneness, of unity of a group. Asab means something like nerve. Asabiyyah is something like the spirit, the nerve of a people. It was something that was brought up in an article about the recent, or now 3 years past, fall of the American funded government in Afghanistan by the Taliban. And it kind of explains the victory of the Taliban, which were technologically inferior to the United States. It explained it by having superior asabiyyah. The identity of the militias fighting the regime there was so tied to the land and was so willing to give up their life in defense or in their struggle for that land, that really wasn't there with the American soldiers or the soldiers hired and trained by the American soldiers, which are mostly there for other geopolitical reasons or personal financial reasons, but could not bring up that kind of asabiyyah, that kind of identity and group spirit that the opposing side had. So regardless of the advantage of technology, it seemed that asabiyyah in the end dominated and determined the victor in that struggle. And it's interesting to bring in this new group identity term, asabiyyah, as opposed to nation or religion, because asabiyyah is an identity that can include both. It's not necessarily a purely ethnic identity. It's also not necessarily purely religious identity. It is just the notion of group identity in general that in general would be a mix of ethnic identities and religious identities, and rarely exclusively one or the other. And so let's have a look at the three main models that Peter Turkmen speaks about. So he speaks about, firstly, the meta-ethnic frontier theory. And that is the theory that once there is a frontier that represents a strong contrast between one side and the other side of the frontier in terms of ethnicity. Once there is, for example, in the case of the Roman Empire, a strong contrast between the languages, the cultures, the ethnicities within the empire and the languages and cultures and ethnicities outside of the empire, you have a dynamic that activates asabiyyah, you could say. So basically this gradient of empire and non-empire, that distinction, that contrast is precisely what fuels asabiyyah. So that contrast, once it is further away of the empire, is not strong enough. You could say that the ethnicities are not confronted with such a large barrier, you could say, and thus the asabiyyahs, the identities, may dissipate quicker. They may dissipate and intermarry with other ethnicities and mix and syncretize religious identities. Yet, when it comes to meta-ethnic frontier, there seems to be some sort of clash happening. There seems to be some sort of barrier that really emphasizes on the difference. So you have an ethnicity across that barrier that really emphasizes its distinction from you, and thus reflects back on your own identity. It brings you more to your authentic sense of who am I, and throws and confronts you and confronts any group with the question of its own identity much stronger, on top of obvious reasons such as real military threats coming from that meta-ethnic frontier. And from here, I'd like to make a little detour to the work of Sir John Glubb. A very interesting short essay, 26 pages, not very widely known, called The Fate of Empires and Search for Survival, actually represents a kind of cliodynamic theory of what happens once asabiyyah is activated at that meta-ethnic frontier. And you can skip right ahead to the summaries, where he speaks about the stages of the rise and fall of great nations. And so the first stage, which he refers to as the outburst, is what I just called the activation of asabiyyah. So it is that which initiates a kind of energy, initiates a kind of radical expansion of that activated identity group. And that is the age of pioneers, the age in which there's a radical, rapid expansion of that people, of that population, onto a wider territory. After that, you get the age of conquests, which kind of has turned that expansion into routine, into a common practice of expanding its resources, expanding its influence, and then ultimately establishing markets and establishing a system, an infrastructure of accumulating wealth, which leads to the next stage, which is the age of commerce. The age of commerce, as there's obviously within that polity a dominating ethnicity, a dominating group, which is the group of the initial asabiyyah. So, for example, the Persians and the Persian Empire were only one group of many that were ruling over the others. Same with the Arabs in the initial caliphates, such as the Umayyad caliphates. And thus, the infrastructure of commerce is structured in such a way that there is an accumulation of wealth, there is a siphoning off of wealth, a kind of geopolitical magnet that accumulates the wealth at the center and at the expense of the periphery, which leads then to an age of affluence, and something that then leads to what is commonly referred to as an age of decadence, or in this case, interestingly enough, an age of intellect. So that is something that I found particularly striking or interesting in Glubb's description, namely that what goes hand in hand with decadence is actually intellectualism. The scientific or rational study and reflection upon the empire is actually what weakens it. The age of affluence allows people to start engaging in intellectual activities and being less inclined to follow and pursue the path of the warrior, the path that was the most, or seen as the most virtuous in the initial stages of outburst and conquest. So the age of intellect, and arguably that's an age we are in now, whatever that means for our time, it would in this case mean that we are in a late stage, and ultimately the age of decadence, of ultimate decadence, where even the intellect is no longer capable of maintaining a system of study that has true merit to it, but it all degenerates into complete decadence. That represents the final stage, where decadence is marked by defensiveness, pessimism, materialism, interestingly enough, frivolity, an influx of foreigners, also interesting, welfare state, also interesting. And what is most fascinating about this is that Glubb even describes some of these developments in societies as old as the Abbasid Caliphate, as old as like the 8th or 9th century or 10th century in Iraq. There was situations where people were complaining about the rise of pop music, of popular music, even back then in the Abbasid Caliphate, that there was a kind of kind of attitude of arrogance of educated folk, and a decline of virtues such as strength and humility and the kind of path of the warrior.